Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of my video series on how to treat blisters. Once again, this is Rodolfo Martinez, athletic trainer with Figure It Out Baseball. I'm going to touch upon phase 2 of blister healing in this video now. So after a couple of days, you'll notice that some new skin has started to fill in and some healing has taken place. And this is when we move into phase 2, and that's making sure that healing occurs as quickly as possible. This is especially important if you're a pitcher and this is on your throwing hand, because you want to make sure you get that feel back through your fingers as quickly as possible. And getting that feel back implies a whole lot more than just making sure you've healed enough so that the skin isn't sensitive anymore. You want to make sure that thing heals completely. So at this point, unless you're outside or somewhere where you're going to be touching a lot of dirty surfaces, I actually like to leave my blisters uncovered. And the reason for this is that you're exposing it to the air, so you're letting that dry up, and that's exactly what you want. You want to make sure that thing is dry, because if you're keeping it covered, you're locking all of that moisture in, and with all of that moisture, all of that new skin that's forming is just getting washed off. So you want to make sure you're leaving it uncovered so you can really allow that moisture to evaporate. The best comparison for this is it's like trying to build new construction in the middle of a flood, right? You're trying to put your bricks down, you're trying to lay your foundation in place, and all that water is just coming by and washing away the progress that you've made. So leaving it uncovered is definitely the way to go at this point. Another consideration is to use zinc oxide cream. And zinc oxide cream has been typically used for diaper rash, actually, in the past. But if you think about diaper rash versus a blister, they're very similar in that it's just an injury, an insult to that superficial layer of the skin. So super important with the zinc oxide cream is that you're leaving only a thin little layer on the actual blister itself. If you're putting too much, again, too much moisture is going to wash away the progress you've made. So just a thin little layer is going to help firm up that tissue. Other considerations for blisters. Number one question that I've heard all the time, should I pop it? So I think the answer here really depends. I think if you are going to pop it, make sure you're doing that in a way that's as clean as can be. By popping that blister, you're creating more of an open wound, so you're increasing the risk of infection. However, if you're doing the right things that I outlined in this video, I think it should be all right. If you have a lot of fluid built up in there, sometimes popping it is beneficial. Again, just making sure you're doing that in a way that's as clean as can be. If the blister is whole, if there's no little rip in the blister, if it's not leaking fluid out of anywhere, then I typically like to leave it alone, especially for the blisters that are pretty flush with the skin. I tend to leave those. I don't like going into a blister too aggressively and cutting out all that skin if I don't have to. Another thing to consider, a lot of baseball players like to put super glue on their blisters. I don't necessarily mind putting super glue on a blister in this second phase. I definitely wouldn't do it in the first phase because super glue isn't something that's sterile. It isn't something that's necessarily clean. So again, in those first couple of days, you're trying to mitigate the risk of injury. I wouldn't put it in those first few days, but in the second phase, maybe, because what happens with the super glue is that you're essentially creating an artificial layer of skin, right? You're putting a little layer over that's going to protect that raw skin from any of the stress, any of the friction, anytime you do any activity, whether it's throwing a baseball, whether it's running in your new cleats, whatever it may be. So super glue is an option. It wouldn't be my first one, but it is an option if you do want to throw some extra protection on that blister. So to wrap up here, 2 different phases of blister healing. First phase, minimizing infection. So keeping it clean, keeping it covered, maybe putting some padding over it if that blister is super sensitive. So products to consider, obviously your Band-Aids and your standard coverings. You may want to consider using an antibiotic cream at this point. You may want to use a product like Second Skin, like I mentioned before, just to create an extra layer of protection. Second phase of blister healing, making sure it heals as quickly as possible. So key notes here, leaving it uncovered as long as you're going to be in a place that's relatively clean. And also, maybe consider putting some of that zinc oxide cream that I mentioned on, just a thin little layer, making sure you're drying that skin out as much as possible. Also touched upon potentially using super glue in this phase to add an extra layer of protection on top of that. That is something you may want to consider if you've used it in the past. I don't necessarily mind using it. I think it's a good way just to add a little bit of extra protection on top of that. Once again, I'm Rodolfo Martinez with Figure It Out Baseball, and this was the video on blisters. Thank you. See you guys next time.